Welcome back, everyone. First of all, on behalf of Indonesian Employers Association, APindo, we would like to thank you for your sympathy and condolences to our earthquake disaster in Aceh yesterday. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this sitting, which will take the form of a special plenary debate on strengthening social dialogue for inclusive and sustainable work. You will no doubt have had the opportunity to read the background note prepared by the office, which is available on the regional meeting website. As we are aware, social dialogue is the key to realizing the sustainable development goals and to reducing inequality. It is one of the key strategic objectives of the ILO and is fundamental to the cause of social justice. Underpinned by some of the ILO's most important conventions, social dialogue can truly be thought of as the organization's lifeblood. We have 2 hours to examine the subject of fundamental importance to the ILO. Our work will take the form of a panel discussion led by a moderator. I should therefore like briefly to introduce our panel this afternoon. It is composed of Ms. Haiyani Rumondang, Director General of Industrial Relations and Workers' Social Security of the Ministry of Manpower Indonesia, Ms. Florence Willie, Executive Director, Employers Federation of Papua New Guinea, Ms. Kearney, President of Australian Council of Trade Unions, Mr. Ernesto Bitonio, Professor of Labor Law and Industrial Relations at the University of Philippines. A warm welcome to all panelists. The moderator, whom I also welcome, is the ILO Deputy Director General for Management and Reform, Mr. Greg Fins. Following the panel presentation, the floor will be open for comments and possible questions to the panel. And we will, of course, encourage as much interaction and exchange of ideas as possible for a really interesting discussion. Please be sure to identify yourself very clearly when taking the floor so we can be as exact as possible when drafting the report of the session. At the end of the afternoon, the moderator will give the floor back to the panel for final comments and conclusion. With that, I should like to pass the management of this session to Mr. Fins.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, delegates. And our apologies for this late commencement, but we'll try and have a good and thorough and efficient discussion on this important issue. In view of the time, I'll just give a brief introduction to our distinguished panel, and then we can get right on with our business. Firstly, it's with great pleasure that I firstly introduce Ms. Haiyani Rumondang, who is the Director General of Industrial Relations and Social Security with the Ministry of Manpower here in Indonesia. She has previously had a range of senior appointments within the Ministry of Manpower, and including as head of their multilateral cooperation, which of course is very relevant to our discussion today. Ms. Rumondang has also had very wide experience in industrial relations and also international labour matters. Our second member of the panel, representing the employers, is Ms. Florence Willie. She is the Executive Director of the Employers Federation of Papua New Guinea. Florence is a lawyer with previous experience working in the Papua New Guinea court system, in private practice, in academia, and also as a legal counsel for the Employers Federation. And in her current role, of course, represents the Employers Federation in a wide range of international fora. And representing the workers today, we have Ms. Jed Kearney. Jed is the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions and has been in that role since 2010. Jed commenced her career as a nurse and nurse educator and went on to becoming an elected official with the Australian Nursing Federation and including as Federal Secretary of the Nursing Federation. Jed has also had close involvement with many international labour issues and particularly within the Asia and Pacific region. And I also welcome our expert today, Mr. Benedicto Bitonio, who is a practicing lawyer, academic and independent consultant, and he works on a wide range of legal, policy and management issues, particularly around labour law and industrial relations. He has previously held a number of senior positions with the Philippines government and has represented that government on the ILO governing body, at the ILC, in ASEAN and also APEC. He provides expert advice to many international and multilateral organisations, including the ILO, across the Asia and Pacific region. So welcome to you all. As the Chair indicated earlier, our topic this afternoon is strengthening social dialogue for inclusive and sustainable growth. And of course, social dialogue really lies at the foundation of the ILO and has done so since 1919, for almost 100 years. The ILO and our social dialogue system is of course unique in the UN system and also in the international system. We are the only organisation that is able to convene discussions like this on a regional level or a global level, and through us and with our support at national levels as well, where we bring together not only governments as our member states, but also the representatives of workers and employers. I think social dialogue and our tripartite nature is recognised as probably one of the greatest strengths of the ILO and what it brings to the international community. But I think, as we've heard in every session of this regional meeting, there are also many challenges associated with making social dialogue work, and they've been highlighted consistently throughout the last few days. As you would have noticed in the Director General's report to this meeting, there is an urgent need to address the challenges in the world of work through meaningful and effective social dialogue and tripartism. The importance of strengthening social dialogue, including in the Asia-Pacific and Arab States region, cannot be overstated, particularly in the context of the transformative changes happening now in the world of work, and also with the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. The DG's report points to some important progress in the region over the past 4 years. However, we still see significant gaps in law and practice, in many cases weak institutions, and low ratification rates of ILO core and governance conventions. One general observation across the region is that in many countries, workers and employers' organisations do not effectively engage in social dialogue and collective bargaining at various levels, or participate in the formulation of public policies, especially in the economic field. Sometimes this is due to an absence of mature industrial relations systems or a lack of capacity on the part of the social partners. One essential ingredient for social dialogue is the role of government, for the creation of spaces and mechanisms for workers and employers to engage constructively in social dialogue, either between themselves or with the governments, and participate in social and economic policy making. One related observation is that a number of countries in the region we see either overly high reliance on minimum wages or a low level of compliance, or both. A key role that workers and employers must play is to set terms of conditions of employment directly through dialogue and negotiations. This includes fixing wages through collective bargaining to complement the minimum wage fixing system, settling disputes peacefully, and enhancing workplace compliance. Moreover, there is a growing evidence to suggest that higher levels of union membership and collective bargaining coverage are often associated with lower levels of inequality. Social dialogue to address gender issues and other inequalities is also key. Issues that can be taken up include women's representation in the process and institutions, the gender pay cap, and women's overrepresentation in certain vulnerable occupations. Equally important is to ensure that these processes and institutions can address challenges in the informal economy. Regional integration is accelerating in some parts of the Asia-Pacific and Arab states. However, mechanisms for cross-border social dialogue and consultation with regional workers and employers' organisations have not been established. Such dialogue and consultations have proven useful to social partners and the regional integration bodies themselves in Latin America, Africa and Europe. And we hope that social partners and governments in this region may wish to consider the usefulness of these approaches in their own integration processes. To meet these challenges and to ensure that social partners are fully involved in the formulation and implementation of national plans for the 2030 Agenda, it will be essential for governments to ensure that universally accepted principles and rights at work, as articulated in the ILO's 1998 Declaration, are fully implemented and integrated into public policy and regulatory endeavours. It's important to ensure across the region that any observed gaps or drawbacks in this regard are duly addressed and backed by political and tripartite commitment. The panel today is going to discuss these challenges, but more importantly, help us identify what needs to be done in the region to address those challenges. So with that introduction, I would like to pose a number of questions to our panel this morning, and I will start with the government representative, Haiyani Rumondang. And if I could start with asking you, in your view, how can social dialogue as a strategic objective of the Decent Work Agenda in itself and as a tool contribute to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda at the regional and national levels? Thank you.
Thanks, Moderator. To begin with, I would like to thank to the ILO that's giving us the opportunity to share in this panel sessions. To respond to the question, I think this is very important, collaborations between body, not just in the sub-regions, but also for the region of Asia Pacific and Arab states. I think this is very important. And this is a key not only for the alignment of the ASEAN community Vision 2025, but also the agenda of SDGs. Since we know that if we learn from the report of the DGs, there are some improvement for the development in some countries, but also there is still unfinished job. I think the key for this is in the country itself, there should be an effective way for social dialogue, but we have to think, how about in the regions? This is very important since in the region or sub-region itself is not fully implemented in terms of maybe mechanism for social dialogue. So I think in the short view of my point of view, this is really contribute to the implementation to 2030. If there is no social dialogue, I think this is very difficult to use the effective way to reach the Agenda 2030. So I can tell like this, for the national level, this is the roots of social dialogue. So if it's effective at the national level, so we can go to the regional level. I think this is not easy task, since in each country within the regions, Asia Pacific regions, there are many variety of dynamic of labor matters, industrial relation matters. So how can we find the effective way to use the social dialogue as a basic tools for reaching to 20 and 30 agenda? So for example, at the national level, of course, each country may adopt the strategy to increase decent work in 2030, even in its program and national economic goals. Of course, which engage and increase the role of stakeholders. Without the role of stakeholders, we realize that there is no achievement for the agenda. So not easy to prepare everything, especially maybe at the national level. So we have to introduce, we have to acknowledge the dynamic at the national level within the regions. So I think this is my first response to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I could just build on that with our employer representative, Florence Willie. Florence, labour market policies are taken to be most effective when they reflect the needs and the realities of the real economy actors. How specifically do you think the existing social dialogue mechanisms can be improved to find shared and effective solutions for better functioning labour markets, especially in the face of new and emerging challenges that have already been discussed in this conference over the last few days? What can be done by governments and employers and workers collectively?
Thank you. The question raises a number of key and important matters for the ILO, especially its agenda on social dialogue and how that should help constituents of the ILO. In answering the question you just asked, we look at it this way from the employer's perspective. Transformation in the nature of work, the change in employment relationship, the proliferation of flexible forms of work and new forms of work, and the impact of technology mean that we need to adopt and explore new ways of social dialogue. The need for effective structures of social dialogue to discuss important issues surrounding the future of work. Tripartite social dialogue mechanisms at the national level, in my opinion, need to be strengthened and activated through capacity building of existing social dialogue institutions. At this juncture, I state that a number of countries have the tripartite social structure set up by law, but it is the manner and the way in which that tripartite social dialogue mechanism should be used that questions, or that begs the question about the weakness in its application. So to ensure the effective functioning of the social dialogue institution, that will be the major role of government, its commitment and the political will to support it. In fact, it calls on the commitment of all tripartite social partners in this cause. And in this instance, I would suggest that training and educating all stakeholder players in the tripartite agenda would be key to improving the way in which the tripartite mechanism can be used in pursuing the agenda for social dialogue amongst all stakeholders. I draw the example in the region where a number of countries have taken up labor law reforms, the process for to have new legislation in place. In my opinion, having a well-defined legislative plan in place is helpful to unite the initial audience of the proposed legislation, namely the legislator, the ultimate audience, the workers and employers, along with the judicial and administrative bodies responsible for ensuring the interpretation and application of the legislation once adopted. Government should have clear objectives, and the purpose and rationale of the new legislation should be set out clearly. Government should be committed and willing to engage in meaningful dialogue and be open to stakeholders' inputs in the drafting of legislation. The legislative process should be transparent and should seek to allow for the consultation of social partners. Social partners should also be committed towards this process in drafting good, well-informed legislation. Involvement of the social partners with knowledge and experience, in my opinion, is relevant. In the relevant fields of work, will supply the drafters of the legislation with crucial information that may otherwise not be available. In some government institutions where the tripartite process is available, we find that the public servants involved in facilitating the machinery do not have the skill, the knowledge, and definitely the experience and information that social partners like the workers and employers have, which can bring meaningful discussions to the table. Another example I will use to demonstrate how social dialogue can be used very effectively is the Decent Work Country programs. The Decent Work Country programs are the ILO's agenda in bringing countries to the table to put to good use in identifying the priorities of that country. It is important that in promoting the Decent Work Country program, the ILO also provides training and guidance on the importance of the Decent Work Country program and its significance to the social partners, and most importantly, make the social partners fully involved in the formulation of the Decent Work Country program from the beginning. When we talk about social dialogue, it's not only about the tripartite process. I encourage social dialogue at the bipartite level as well. And at the bipartite level, this is where employers and workers can engage at the enterprise level. Enterprise level social dialogue can be considered an example of a corporate strategy to uphold labor management relations. In order to allow for effective and efficient management relations, the ILO can provide the relevant assistance to employer organizations so that they can strengthen their capacity and to assist their members. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's, if I now turn to the workers' representative, Jed Kearney. Jed, it is interesting that both of our previous speakers have indicated the variety of opportunities and mechanisms that are available. However, as Florence has just indicated, they need strengthening, they need greater capacity building, but there are some areas of success. From your experience as a trade unionist and looking at the whole issue of principles of freedom of association and collective bargaining and their strong link with effective social dialogue, can you give us some examples of where you think respect for these principles has led to better outcomes, not only for workers, but also for governments and employers as well?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you to the previous speakers, because I agree with a lot of what you said. I think it is important to remind ourselves that, according to the ILO, for good social dialogue to take place, we need strong, independent workers and employers organisations that, as Florence pointed out, have the technical capacity and access to relevant information to participate in social dialogue. We need the political will and commitment to engage in social dialogue from all parties, and we need respect for the fundamental rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining. And I think also appropriate institutional support, which we've heard already. And as you pointed out, Chair, social dialogue is very important for the prosperity of all people. In fact, now more than ever, we're living in a time when labour is becoming more informal, where it's mobile, it is precarious, where inequality and fragility is on the rise. We are seeing a lot of disquiet and discontent that is resulting in extreme political outcomes around the world. And so at a time like this, being able to sit down with the social partners and work through these things is more important than ever. And unfortunately, our region is far from exempt from these developments, as we've heard from many of our brothers and sisters throughout these last couple of days. And we've also heard that decent work is all but a dream for so many people. And while we hear that our economies are improving, wealth is not being evenly spread, unions and unionists are attacked, millions of workers are still stripped of their basic trade union rights and are forced into precarious, exploitable and sometimes dangerous situations. It's happening right now in my own country, even Australia. So for social dialogue to be successful, all parties have to come to the process with good faith and intend to work towards a common solution. being blocking or reneging or simply not engaging is just as bad as not having a process at all. So good news stories. I think it's an important question, and I think it's important to see where it is working. If you don't mind, I will indulge and use my own country as an example to start with. We are in Australia dealing with the closure of coal-fired power stations and the winding down of that entire industry in the battle against climate change. Unions, employers and governments are working together to formulate a just transition for the workers and their families and their communities that are going to be affected by the closure of the coal mines, to make sure that those communities aren't destroyed. Now, this is being done through a truly tripartite approach, and unions are hoping to negotiate with employers and governments a planned closure of the power stations with pooling of redundancies and redeployment options right across the industry, along with planning, of course, for the diversification of those communities' economies. So ultimately, of course, this will mean certainty for the industry, for workers, for their families, for the communities and for the businesses that operate in those communities and will be affected as well. Across the region, with technical assistance of the ILO, we know of other good success stories. For example, in Jordan, there is a tripartite structure that's been established, or many tripartite structures, such as the Economic and Social Councils and the Tripartite Committee to decide the minimum wage. Where labour law has been reformed in countries like Vietnam, Oman, the occupied Palestinian territories, and Myanmar, tripartism has been instrumental in working through the process, through social dialogue. However, it is of course important to note that many of the established tripartite institutions are actually dysfunctional. And this is because of a lack of trade union rights, particularly the freedom of association and collective bargaining. For example, in India, the labour laws were changed by the government without consultation with trade unions. In Australia, again, going back to my home country, anti-union laws are being made very recently that actually stop and hinder trade unions from doing their work, from being able to effectively collectively bargain, and impede the freedom of association. So you can't say you are committed to social dialogue and then not practice it in reality. Fixing a minimum wage is also importantly done on a tripartite basis so that the voices of workers and business are heard. The Arab states have recently had success, I believe, in this area, along with many countries. But again, there's an unfortunate tag to this. Unfortunately, migrant workers are still unable to enjoy the set minimum wage, as well as suffering a severe lack of trade union rights. Moreover, we are seeing the minimum wage be eroded and the role of unions diminished in so many places. If these things are done with only government decrees or in the absence of laws that accommodate the needs of workers and only look after business interests, we will see the exploitation and abuse of workers and their rights, and we will see rising inequality, and we will see political unrest. So I think I'll leave it there, Greg.
Well, thanks very much for that, Jed, and I'm very pleased to hear about the approach being taken in the coal-fired power stations, and indeed the main one you're referring to was where I had my first job after leaving school, so I hope you do it well. If I could now turn, having had those comments from our constituents, just to have a broader look at this question from Benedicto Bitonio, who has, as I indicated before, worked not only for the ILO but a number of other international organisations, particularly across this region. And Benedicto, the research from a range of organisations and scholars has shown a close correlation between higher levels of union density and collective bargaining coverage on the one hand and lower levels of inequality on the other. As governments in the region and across the world have made a commitment under the Sustainable Development Goals to reduce inequality, how can collective bargaining be better integrated into policies in order to achieve the strategic goals?
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, collective bargaining and social dialogue can be an effective tool in helping achieve sustainable development goals like reducing poverty and inequality. if it is widely practiced by workers and employers. In most of the Asia-Pacific region, however, the efficacy of social dialogue and collective bargaining in bringing about these goals is limited by low trade union density and low collective bargaining coverage. Typically, you have about less than 15% of your workforce, of your formal sector workforce, who are members of unions or are covered by collective bargaining agreements, with the possible exception of Australia, which has a higher trade union density. But for most countries, therefore, the continuing challenge is how to progressively build a policy environment that enables expansion of unionism, collective bargaining, and representation to a broader base of workers and employers. Building a proper institutional framework would be a critical factor in achieving that. The fundamental principles and rights at work, as we all know, have general support in the Asia-Pacific region. Even so, many countries have not ratified ILO Conventions 87 and 98. Even rarer is the ratification of other related conventions, such as Convention 141 pertaining to rural workers' organizations, which is key to the inclusion of rural workers' organizations in the social dialogue process, and also Conventions 151 and 154 pertaining to the public sector. While most countries would have their own labor laws and legislations, there is a wide divergence as to their coverage, scope, and effectiveness in both law and practice. So I'll just focus on what has been documented as deficits in the countries across the region. There are deficits in the policy and legal environment that tend to constrain the effective exercise of freedom of association and the rights to organize and bargain. We are probably familiar with some of them. One would be threats, acts of harassment and violence, killings and disappearances committed against trade unionists, many of which have been brought to the Committee of Experts and application of standards in the ILO. And I think some of these cases have yielded observations and directives for the specific governments concerned to take action and correct these illegal acts. In some instances, there is formal legal recognition of the rights to collectively bargain and the right to organize. But if you look at the laws and legislations themselves, you will find that there are provisions in the laws themselves that tend to constrain the effective exercise of the right to organize. Examples of this are unreasonably high threshold requirements for union formation and collective bargaining representation, lack of dissuasive sanctions against violations of trade union and collective bargaining rights, legalistic processes and preconditions before actual collective bargaining can take place, underdeveloped collective bargaining structures. In some areas, collective bargaining is limited to the enterprise level, and there is no space for collective bargaining at the higher levels. Limitations on the scope and subject matter of collective bargaining, restrictions on the right to strike and lockout, and ineffective or excessive state intervention in trade union and collective bargaining matters. So these are, I think you are all very familiar with these issues. For some countries, they look at collective bargaining and freedom of association as some sort of a lower level priority, such that there is indifference or low importance given by governments and economic planning agencies to the value of the fundamental principles and decent work in the country's own economic, political, and cultural agenda. Now, even in countries with more advanced industrial relation systems, and much more so in the less developed ones, as pointed out earlier, you have emerging challenges like the rise of non-standard forms of employment. The game is changing. Without sacrificing fundamental principles, the rules of the game must be reinvented and encouraged to evolve toward creatively assimilating workers under non-standard forms of employment under the coverage of collective agreements. In some countries, popular expectations primarily look at state action, not the action of the parties to resolve workplace issues, economic and social inequalities. So there is tremendous pressure for the political process rather than the collective bargaining process to provide solutions to workplace issues through legislation rather than negotiation. Now, this is not undesirable, and in many instances, in some instances, this may even be necessary, especially with respect to basic rights and in areas where there is market failure. But, well, prudent state action is always advisable, as over-reliance on legislation can actually constrict the space for collective bargaining. In some instances, we take note of the changing attitudes, particularly of the millennials who are already in the workforce. They may have the right to organize and to bargain, but they do not exercise these rights. And in many instances, there are now less institutionalized and less formal voice channels in workplaces that allow workers and employers to interact without being constrained by the formal processes, legal processes of collective bargaining. And this somehow fuels the perception that organized collective action may be unnecessary. I think that some of the things that I've mentioned can be addressed by labor law reforms as a key element in institution building. We can start with some of the things that have been observed across the region. Removal of distinctions on who may exercise freedom of association and the right to organize, for instance, particularly in the public sector, migrant workers and foreigners, undue restrictions on union formation, simplified democratic methods to select collective bargaining representatives, including enabling unions who do not have majority support yet to exercise at least collective bargaining rights for their own members, enabling collective bargaining to take place at several levels rather than simply having it take place at one level, like an enterprise level or an industry level bargaining, and also limiting the use of compulsory arbitration processes. I also should make a pitch for harmonizing national laws to promote effective exercise of freedom of association and collective bargaining of migrants through union membership and representation that is portable across borders. Of course, the provisions against unfair labor practices and anti-union discrimination, as well as an efficient labor dispute mechanism should be in place. Now, there is a larger role. There are matters that cannot be covered by collective bargaining, as we conventionally know it, and social dialogue should take care of that in a larger policy sphere. In some countries, it is good to know that social dialogue is already institutionalized. And in some, they talk about not only about terms and conditions of employment, but social policies concerning social protection. They even talk about total incomes policy, including taxation. They talk about the structural impediments to trade union and collective bargaining growth, particularly the high level of informality in many countries across the Asia Pacific. And there are also forces that they can talk about, which are outside the conventional boundaries of industrial relations, but are very important nevertheless, particularly on the vulnerable workers. I'm talking about things like adapting to climate change, because the climate change risks actually, to which many of our countries in the region are exposed, actually hit the most vulnerable workers most. I'm also talking about some countries in the region which are hounded by their own internal conflicts. And these conflicts are particularly traumatic with long-term consequences on children, women, young workers. I'm also talking about pandemics and financial crisis. We now have an interdependent world which where economic opportunities have multiplied, but the dangers arising from that interdependence has also multiplied. So these are possible areas for broadening not only the space, but also the substantive discourse on social dialogue that probably workers, employers, and governments can pursue in promoting this social dialogue and collective bargaining as instruments to promote equality and poverty reduction.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. And I think if I can turn back to our government representative, Haiyani Rumondang, because I think Mr. Bitonio has just given a list of measures that are available to improve social dialogue. He's also indicated there are consequences when social dialogue is not used effectively. The Director General's report to this meeting gives many examples of where social dialogue is used well. You get much better policy outcomes as a result. So at a practical level, what can governments do to improve the mechanisms, but not only the mechanisms, the actual use and participation in social dialogue?
Thanks. I think the first step is, of course, by committed to put in the law and regulations. And example in Indonesia, there are two kinds. I mean that there is, as said by the expert, that the social dialogue itself can be through bipartite or tripartite itself. So I think in Indonesia we do all this kind of social dialogue in the formal basis, and this is put in the law on labor in Indonesia. So I think when we think about the concrete steps, I think we are different within countries, of course. Like in Indonesia, this is like an example. The step is we do informally, so it's not just put it like a formal basis as stated by the law, but we have to do in informal dialogue, because I can say that Indonesia is the first country, I think, in the Asia Pacific regions to ratify all core conventions. We already ratify all core conventions. Then, since that there are major changes in Indonesia, at the times we have some kind of consultations within the tripartite, which is before we ratify the convention. We still have a tripartite committee, but that's under just a single union. But after the ratify the convention, so we have a lot of union. So the concrete measure that I already mentioned, that the first is we have a commitment to put in the law, in the regulations. Then the practical basis is not easy. That's not easy, really. That's not easy. When we do that, how can we urge our stakeholders, social partner from the union, that are many unions? So this is, I think, can be the good point to us here, how we do the effective social dialogue within the different climates of industrial relations. As expert already said that there is another underlying causes for the reason, something like that, of the union, or even from the employers and also the government. So even we already put in the formal basis, we have to do the informal basis. This is very important, since a lot of people, a lot of interest, and a lot of wanting everything to do the best, even for employers and also in union. So I think Indonesia, this is a very unique, since we have a lot of union, then we already here under the law, even, it's not perfectly, but at least we already start. We already start. This is very important. So we have to work hard how to arrange in the effective way. So we have a bipartite. This is compulsory basis in Indonesia, compulsory to establish bipartite committee itself to be the roots, this is the root basis for the dialogue in a company. But that's not easy, that's not easy. Then, even it's already compulsory, because to establish the committee, bipartite committee in one company, we have to rely to the both party. We cannot force to the both party to communicate between them. I think I really agree what our colleagues from Australia told, that there should be a good faith. There should be a good faith. Without good faith in each partners, I think we cannot reach the essential of social dialogue, I think. So this is Indonesia. We do the formal by bipartite committee, tripartite committee at the national level and also at the provincial level, even at the municipality level. We have a lot of, a lot of tripartite committee. This is actually I have to, to telling the truth. That's not implement perfectly. Yeah, that's not implement perfectly. Since the tripartite committee itself is very broad, because we also have a tripartite formal dialogue also in other substance. Yeah, so I think this is another side of tripartite committee that we very highly hope that the committee is, the main strategy to do social dialogue. But I think Indonesia facing the difficulties when we have to, telling the truth, when we have to do the one strategy, the good strategy for the country who has a lot of union. How many union can be represented in one formal consultation, in one formal institution? So this is not really easy. Then for the informal discussion, we do a kind of this informal, because sometimes when we try to conclude in the formal institution, but the conclusion or the consideration which we already raised cannot be easy received by other, by other in the out, the external in the others from the external this institution. So we need strong commitment. Yes, I think government should have the strong commitment to us to encourage social partners to be the main actors to reach, the sustained development. But that's not easy. We have to do, because this is really, I think, the unique of freedom association and also collective bargaining. In the collective bargaining itself, maybe there are some similarity to within the region, but in our country, it's really different that you already mentioned. In our country, collective bargaining is done in the company level. So we can indicate that the highly number of collective labor agreement, the result of the collective bargaining in our country is collective labor agreement. We can indicate that the highly number of collective labor agreement in Indonesia, it means that the sign of collective bargaining effectively. But I can say, like Indonesia right now, the number of company is about more than 200,000. Then the number of collective labor agreement, which is resulted from the bargaining within both parties, is just under 14,000. It means it is indicated because of, union in one CLA can be result from, many unions. So for the concrete step in Indonesia, I can say that there is bipartite committee, tripartite committee, there is another tripartite committee special for occupational safety and health, productivity, then also for the wage council. Then we do also dialogue like International Labor Conference mechanism, tripartite committee. We also have like a GB under the tripartite committee. So this GB, governing body of tripartite committee in our country, this is actually the main actors for, for resulting the good consultations, like let's say that for giving recommendations and also giving the response to for improving the law and regulations. But this is not the end of the process. Sometimes when we do this in the tripartite committee itself, this is not a real, this is not the real response from a lot of, or from the wholes of the workers in our country. I think so.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the point you raised, that it doesn't matter whether it's in bipart dialogue or tripart dialogue, whether it's in a formal structure or an informal structure, it is the good faith and the goodwill required of all of the parties to make it the most effective. If I could turn now to our employer representative, Florence Willie. Florence, one of the areas of recent years of increased activity is all around the formalisation of the informal economy. And certainly from the employer's point of view within the ILO, they are becoming very actively engaged in that process as well. How do you think social dialogue can facilitate at the local level that transition from informal to formal?
That's a very interesting topic for debate and discussion. From the informal economy to the formal economy brings on its own problems with it. But that's an agenda that the ILO, in my opinion, is now taking on board. In order to answer this question, I cite the example of the social dialogue in facilitating the transition from the informal to the formal economy per the recommendation number 204. Recommendation number 204 was adopted in 2015 at the International Labour Conference in Geneva. Some measures from the recommendation number 204 include the need to establish an inclusive growth strategy that would promote the expansion of the formal economy and promote the creation of decent and productive employment, the promotion of a conducive business and investment environment, the need to harness and develop the entrepreneurial spirit of informal economy operators, the need to reduce barriers to the transition to the formal economy, such as those related to registration, taxation, and compliance with laws and regulations. The need to promote micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises and provide with them incentives to grow. The need to promote access to education, lifelong learning, and skills development. The need to provide access to financial services, which is important. The need to provide access to business and development services. The need to provide access to markets, and the need to provide access to infrastructure and technology, amongst others. Social dialogue, in my opinion, can be effective in implementing these measures as recommended under recommendation number 204. In developing countries, many individuals, or developing economies, many individuals are attracted to the informal economy out of necessity. That is, they have no other opportunities, and these persons would be youth and women. The challenge is to understand the different aspirations and capacities of those who operate in this economy and not prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach. There is also the need to address some of the reasons or the barriers why they choose to remain in the informal economy. For example, registration cost, cost of setting up a business, cost of taxation, compliance with the laws, and looking at the kind of hours that they can operate in, flexible or be they set hours. There is also a need to formulate a national action plan to tackle informality, and this should be done with consultation with businesses, which possess the necessary information and market data that can inform policy making. We need to break the culture of corruption and impunity. I repeat, we need to break the culture of corruption and impunity and help ensure that public institutions are trustworthy, that authorities are accountable for their decisions and actions, and that engaging in any corrupt action can expect to be subject to the rule of law. This can be done through effective social dialogue involving the private sector in policy processes through the representative organizations. So once again, I stress that point. In order for effective social dialogue, we need to educate and train and arm the people behind the scenes involved in the discussions around tripartism, bipartisan, and also the discussions on the informal economy workers who would eventually become part of our formal economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. And Jed, if I can come back to you from the workers' perspective, as Florence has just been talking about the vulnerable workers in the informal economy, but also right across this region, there a representation gap for many categories of vulnerable workers, including migrants and those in the informal economy. From a workers' perspective, what measures can or should the three constituents take to close the gap in order to better provide protections for all workers?
Thanks, Greg. Starting with governments, I think there's going to be quite a lot of overlap, really, with what most people have said, but it's worth going through it, I think, again. So we think that governments really must ensure that their countries maintain decent labour regulations that cover all workers, including vulnerable workers, and there needs to be strong penalties against employers who exploit and discriminate against workers. I think we really need to start focusing more closely on regional and sub-regional cooperation processes, and we need a lot of strong regional political will. Again, we come back to political will to stop the exploitation of migrant workers and women, of course, in particular, who are overrepresented in this area, domestic workers and, of course, workers in rural areas. Vulnerable workers need to be able to organise, to bargain collectively. They must have access to decent social protection. They need strong occupational health and safety laws. There need to be anti-discrimination laws. There needs to be recognition and development of their skills and true access to tripartite processes. And of course, ratification in the region of ILO standards, once again, we come back to that, must be a priority. For employers, I think employers, they can't hide behind the economic growth at all costs mantra. Growth has to be inclusive. From our perspective, a job is not a job unless it delivers a decent living wage, unless it comes with dignity, with safety and respect. I hear time and time again that you should just be grateful you have a job. But as I said, a job is not a job unless it comes with those things. We know that strong economies where everybody prospers are those that have decent social protection, they have fair taxation regimes that help distribute wealth, they have decent minimum wages, and they have freely organised labour with true tripartite processes. And too often we hear from employers that these are decried. They're things that are seen as belittling of the role of government, or that they're red tape, or that they are barriers to business. We don't see them as red tape. In fact, I often say back home when employers complain about all of these red tapes, like occupational health and safety regulation, for example, we say they're not red tape, they are blue ribbons. They are blue ribbons that protect workers. They make for fair and prosperous business and a robust economy, and they provide political stability. We see this from reports from organisations like the IMF, like the OECD, the World Bank, of course the ILO. I think, I forget, somebody did raise the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we certainly need to give them more attention in the region, and they are a good blueprint for how we can approach these issues. And tracking and enforcing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think are going to be vital to achieving all of this. And on to unions. I think there are lots of things that unions need to do, and perhaps a bit differently. We need to organise vulnerable workers. But not only that, we need to allow them into our structures, into our formal union structures. The traditional structures of unions may not be suitable anymore to properly represent vulnerable workers. We need affirmative action rules for women, for young people, and for other diverse groups to be properly represented within our unions. We need new ways of organising, new ways of bargaining. We need to be open about how we campaign and what we campaign around. In Australia, an example of how we're starting to be a bit flexible, and I was discussing this before, is a grassroots Korean workers' union has been formed, has just grown up from Korean workers, from migrant workers who are being, unfortunately, exploited in Australia. This is a challenge for everybody. It's a challenge for unions who are very protective of their structures. This union is across all industries. It has different internal structures. But as a union movement, we can see the benefit that it brings to those workers, and we need to be prepared to embrace it and see how we can work with these things that are growing up around us and challenging our traditions. I think cross-border campaigning and international cooperation for the issues for migrant workers must increase. Women workers in particular must be better organised and represented. We're seeing a lot of cross-border cooperation in the Pacific. Indeed, Florence and I have worked together on a really great project that was auspiced by the ILO and the Australian government some time ago. We're seeing it at Samoa. There's New Zealand, I know, has been instrumental in working with some of the Pacific Islands in cross-country organising and campaigning. I think we need to do more of that. There has been a newly formed domestic workers union in Lebanon, which is another good example of how a vulnerable workforce like domestic workers can have a voice and agency in this regard. We certainly hope that burgeoning union grows and is legitimised by the Lebanese government to recognise the new union, again, that it's grown, slightly different to the normal structures, but we would like it to be respected, and certainly we hope that it is supported. So that's the government, employers, and my thoughts on unions. But Greg, I'd just like to raise one fourth force that I think has to take up the fight to close the gap for vulnerable workers, and that's at the international institutional level. And here I'd like to note the important role that the ILO could certainly play in this respect. We are not advocating at all that the ILO compromise on its rights-based approach and the universality of rights on which it was established, but it must engage with governments and these institutions to promote social dialogue. Institutions like ASEAN, like APEC, like the Asia Development Bank, the Arab League and other Arab sub-regional structures, we believe have to start enforcing rights for workers and their rights to organise and bargain in all of their negotiations, in all of their contractual obligations, in all of the work they do amongst each other. For example, we know that ASEAN has resisted engaging worker organisations like the ASEAN Trade Union Council, and yet they have from the very beginning engaged with employer organisations. We see it again in the Bali process, how a business council has been set up to engage with businesses around trafficking and other criminal activities, and yet there is no similar engagement with trade unions from that process. Otherwise, I think we are in danger of seeing this whole area of corporate social responsibility becoming nothing but a weak substitute for collective bargaining and social dialogue, and we certainly do not want to see that happen. So I think I'd just like to finish there. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks. Thank you for that, Jed. And finally, before I open the floor, if I can come back to you, Benedicto, as a number of you have mentioned, and in my introductory comments, one of the basic uses and most important uses of social dialogue is around fixing of minimum wages, and then in advance of that, collective bargaining for above minimum wages. What do you think are the key elements that social dialogue needs to embrace to have an impact on minimum wages and effective collective bargaining?
What we have seen in the region are different approaches in wage fixing. So countries have developed their own methods of wage fixing, but there are, of course, similarities. For instance, wage policies typically differentiate between the public and the private sectors. The definition of wage, for the most part, is a broad definition compatible with international standards. And the objective of having a broad definition of wage is to make sure that the laws on wage protection have a broader mantle of protection to, especially to the vulnerable workers and workers in precarious work. Most countries in the region that have minimum wage fixing mechanisms seem to have embraced the concept of minimum wage as a floor wage with the force of law that is not subject to compromise or not subject to abatement, and failure to comply with the minimum wage will amount to will make the employer concerned liable for administrative and in some cases penal sanctions. Typically, we also see an inspectorate as an indispensable mechanism to enforce minimum wages. The two variations of minimum wage fixing approaches have emerged. On the one hand, you have the selective approach where minimum wage fixing is done only with respect to specific industries. We are seeing that in some countries in the region now. For instance, Vietnam, Cambodia have initiated wage fixing in the garment sector. The other approach is a more general one, where the notion of minimum wage fixing is really taken as a social floor applicable to all workers, although there may be some differentiation in rates in minimum wage levels across regions, and the differentiation is sometimes based on the level of development of particular regions. Minimum wage mechanisms also have variations in terms of extent of authority, design, and means of action. In some countries, the wage mechanism itself makes the decision to fix the minimum wage rates. In other countries, the wage mechanism is makes recommendations, but the approval of those recommendations is lodged with a higher government body, typically the legislative body or a prime ministerial level action. In some instances, you have a softer type of mechanism where The mechanism is used merely to generate inputs that will inform the policy-making process at higher levels. Then again, typically at the level of the parliament or at the level of legislation. We have also seen that minimum wage action may be decreed, may be legislated, or simply delegated to the wage mechanism itself. The observation has been made, as you have pointed out, that a number of countries in the region tend to have over-reliance on minimum wages, and some of them also have a low level of compliance where the minimum wages are fixed. And in some cases, both problems arise. There are also observations of a sex or gender-based wage gap that are especially skewed against women and the youth and the young workers. I think that these observations underscore the need to emphasize that first, minimum wage fixing at the very least should be taken as a measure to help people out of abject poverty and promote equal treatment, particularly those at the lower level of the wage scale who are mostly underrepresented in collective bargaining. And also the need for an effective enforcement mechanism. As I've said, it is absolutely indispensable to ensure that those who need it most benefit from minimum wage action. We have some ideal characteristics of a minimum wage mechanism, and this is, of course, something that the individual governments and social partners in specific countries may think about. The first ideal characteristic would, of course, be to have a regular wage-fixing mechanism that is institutionalized and sufficiently authorized to act with the force of law. This mechanism would have tripartite representation, of course, where workers and employers' representatives participate as independent and equal parties accountable to their respective sectors. In some cases, for instance, in the Philippines where I come from, the workers' representatives in the wage boards, as well as the employers' representatives, they come from the most representative associations. But they also tend to be proxy representatives of those who are not their members. And it's very important that in this situation, they should engage or do more public consultation so that they can represent a wider spectrum of sectoral interests. Sometimes the tripartite process is supplemented by public consultations that allows inputs from a wider base of constituents. Another ideal characteristic would be the incorporation of the principles of non-discrimination and equal protection in the application of minimum wages. And then, of course, the safeguards to ensure that minimum wage fixing is a baseline standard, with collective bargaining is still the preferred mode of fixing wages higher than the baseline, so as not to see a situation where minimum wage fixing crowds out the collective bargaining process. There should also be adequate and functional mechanisms, including, again, as I've said, labor inspection to ensure that employers comply with the minimum wage rates. In some instances, and I think this is a long-standing advocacy of workers and workers' organizations and unions, the participation or representation of unions in the inspectorate system. We hear of that kind of advocacy. I do not know how governments are open to it, but I would suppose that if that is done, then there has to be a system of accountability that should accompany it, so that the police powers of the state, which they actually are very concerned about, are not seen to be eroded by the interests of unions. So I think that those are some of the ideal characteristics in a wage mechanism that we have seen, tripartite in nature, and you have representation that can sometimes expand to a proxy representation. In some countries, all these characteristics are actually present. In others, only a few are present, and in some, well, there are still countries with no institutionalized wage fixing mechanisms. But I think that these are measures, or these are areas which particular countries can think about in terms of improving their wage fixing mechanisms.
Well, thanks very much for that. That was very helpful and indeed to all members of the panel for your comments so far. We're now at that time where we can open it up for questions. In view of the late start of this session, though, we will need to be as efficient as we possibly can with the use of this time. And so I do ask that anybody wanting to raise a question does literally that, not make an intervention, but ask a question so that we can get to as many delegates as possible in the time that we have available. So I'll open the floor now. Indonesia.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Sulistri from KSBSI Indonesia. So if Kearney has shared the successful story on social dialogue in Australia, then I will also share the challenges of the social dialogue in Indonesia. That you know that, particularly in the environmental issue. So Indonesia is the second largest producer of the palm oil in the world. It has made this industry important for the employment creation that cannot be denied. But this industry also have negative impact to the environmental degradation. Their circumstances in many times has caused some conflict to other stakeholders between trade union and environmental group. This is one of example of the social dialogue challenges in Indonesia. Because trade union not only deal with the traditional partners such business and government, but also other stakeholders such as indigenous people, environmental group. In order to make social dialogue more effective and more inclusive, trade union, social movement, and labor right NGOs should be defined as much as possible common position with regard to the right and the interest of workers. So the good opportunity to address is the sustainability growth. It's true that sustainable development goals. Some speakers have mentioned about it. Because every country is obligated to create scenario and reducing the carbon dioxide with the specific indicator and also the target. So my union, KSBSI, together with the other GSO, also has been involved as a member of National Steering Committee for the SDGs. Therefore, I like to suggest 2 points to the speaker. First, the involvement of the trade union and other GSOs such as women, young people, informal economy, environmental group, indigenous people group to participate in the implementation of the SDGs. Second, we demand to the government to incorporate the sustainability issue as stipulated in the SDGs and every free trade agreement, both in bilateral and also regional, which has recently occurred in the many countries. I thank you, sir.
Thank you for that question. I'll take 2 or 3 questions. I'll go to I'll go to the Malaysia. Sorry, I can't see that far.
Bangladesh. Thank you, Chair. I would like to recall the Director General mentioning about the 4th Industrial Revolution and technological innovations which are bound to come. Now the debate is whether it's going to create more jobs or destroy existing number of jobs. However, we cannot stand in the way of technology. It is bound to happen. Now, that being the case, I think there is no better time to realize the importance of social dialogue as one of ILO's key strategic objectives, particularly in the context of this transformative change. Now, in some industries, the relationship is more confrontational than others, particularly because of the suspicion of both the parties. Now, do you not think, under the circumstances, the main solution is to go for specific training of workers as well as employers in all those developing countries where we are having problems in a proper social dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yes, ITUC.
Ya, baik. Saya Iwan Kusmawan dari KSPI.
My name is Iwan Kusmawan from KSPI Indonesia. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for the opportunity. And secondly, when we are discussing about social dialogue towards an inclusive development and sustainable, it's very interesting because some speakers already convey in their presentation in several Pacific country what we can put as a consideration when the social dialogue have been working properly. There is several indicators that could be used as a guidance by ILO. The first one is, of course, when a country where the dialogue social have been implemented properly, then it means there should be no more action that has a characteristic, and of course the welfare of the workers should be properly applied, and there should be no more criminalization, including in the union busting, as well as the workers' welfare should be provided as enacted in the law. On the other hand, that when the social dialogue have been implemented properly, there should be a balance where in a nation, where in a country, how many enterprises, how many trade unions, and how many collective bargaining have been signed. It will demonstrate that in the social dialogue there is a balance between one and another. And the third point that I would like to share is that when we are talking about a tripartism, there should be no more policy that is not been implemented through social dialogue, because this point, and if this is happened, it's already violated what ILO already reported in their report from 1 to 30, that social dialogue is aimed towards sustainable development. Therefore, we shouldn't put the social dialogue just as a tool, as a camouflage weapon or a ceremonial weapon, and that's what we would like to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Tonga? Tonga?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the Kingdom of Tonga, my name is Victorina Kioa, CEO for our Tonga Chamber of Commerce, representing employers, of course. I have a question from your newest member, and as clearly stated by the speakers, there is a clear need for capacity building. How can ILO assisting in building and strengthening the capacity of our constituents to have effective and meaningful social dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tonga, and welcome to the ILO. I'll just take one more and then I'll hand to the panel. And Hong Kong, I think. Hong Kong. Was someone from Hong Kong? Was on? Oh, okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Lee Chuk-yan, General Secretary of the Hong Kong Confederation Trade Unions. I agree with the speaker, Sister Kearney, about that effective social dialogue must be based on true representation. In our case in Hong Kong, the employee representative to our tripartite body were not chosen on the basis of most representative organization as stipulated by the International Labour Convention 144. The Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, as the second largest basing on membership, was excluded, while the largest one and other smaller ones were included. My question is, how then can the ILO intervene? Given that we have a problem, we cannot challenge the credential of advisors. This is the status of Hong Kong, of course, because. Secondly, we believe also that foundation to social dialogue is collective bargaining. And I agree with another speaker, the professor, that we must need the law. And the HKCTU had complained to the ILO on the government non-compliant to ILC number 98 back in 1998. And had got very helpful recommendations, including suggestions for legislative framework on collective bargaining. But the Hong Kong government had not followed up on it. And are there any further mechanism that I can use to, sort of push for legislation and push for ILO recommendation to be implemented in Hong Kong? And the third question is, I believe that social dialogue must also be based on the right to form independent union. In any one-party state, the government, employer, union are all three in one. Social dialogue is then rendered meaningless since the voice of the workers cannot be brought into the system. The Chinese government reasons crackdown on labor NGO service to workers in Guangzhou, putting several labor activists in jail, show the worrying trend that workers outside the system would be completely silent. So how we can include, in one-party state, workers outside the system, and how to urge more Asian Pacific countries to ratify the Convention 87 and 98 for true representation of workers and freedom association. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We will now turn back to our panel now to address some of those issues that have been raised. There was the issue about particularly around the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, but then also the question of the role of other stakeholders in social dialogue. And Director General, I might turn to you just from a government perspective on particularly around the SDGs. Certainly the SDGs do call on the UN system as a whole to be engaging broadly. As we've discussed this afternoon, it's natural for the ILO to be engaging with its tripartite constituents, but what about government role in dealing with other stakeholders?
Thanks, Moderator. I think in the context of SDGs, I try to, to take out some of the questions that I think there is a key point is how amongst the partners should be put in the main perception is trust of things. I think this is very important, since also I have we hear also the discussion, the question about that there is no there is no trust between both, and also of course there is no trust also to the government. So if we don't put this in the main purpose of our social dialogue, especially for the context of SDGs, I can't believe it that the SDGs that we already committed, can be achieved properly. So when I have to say that the role of the government to put these two kinds of relations to be a balance, again, I can say that there is no easy task, since like our countries already ratified our convention, we still facing more difficulties. So we try, our government try to put, the first is to us have some dialogue within, I already explained that, within the structures, even in the formal or informal mechanism. Then the second, we believe that if each of us, even in the employer sides, union sides, or worker sides, or government sides, have responsibility to strengthen our institutions, and also, of course, our capabilities to develop that. This is the aims of SDGs, this all of our responsibility. I think the way will easy to do that. We know that government has a heavy task because all goes to government. If the union cannot be participated effectively, the government will be blamed. If the employers cannot be participated effectively, the government will be blamed. So I think we have to put in the fundament things is we have to put mutual trust. Governments try to give the optimum efforts. For example, we do the training for workers. We do the dialogue not just for workers, also for employers. But let's say we go hand in hand, we go together. This is, I think, that the government will do. But again, that's not easy. We try, and then I think we will try to improve. So if there is improvement, cannot be reached, there is no one can take a benefit. There is no one. We have to take a benefit. I think this is that I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jed, could I ask you both on that issue of engagement with other stakeholders, but also I think the comment that our Bangladesh delegate made around social dialogue and the approach in more confrontational environments, that it's not one size fits all. Would you like to just address those 2 points?
Sure. I think certainly there are times when it is absolutely necessary to engage broadly with NGOs. There's no doubt about it, and the Sustainable Development Goals are an area that we should, and we do, in areas of human trafficking and slavery and child labour. There's a lot of good work, I think, that unions do broadly with NGOs, and that has to happen, and I think we probably need to do it a lot more, and I agree with my sister there. However, I think what there is a danger is that NGOs are not organised labour. They are different, they have different interests, they have different loyalties, they are funded in different ways. And I think that if we come to a position where engagement is all, say, for example, corporate sector and NGOs, and organised labour doesn't have a voice, then I think we have a problem. And I'm seeing it, I have to say, sadly, more and more. I was at a UN Council on the Status of Women recently, where the business sector was all engaged and was very much a part of it, and the trade union movement had to fight to even get a voice in that forum. And it was very difficult to talk in that forum about things like collective bargaining and the freedom to associate. So whilst yes, I absolutely agree, it's important and there are times when we need to engage, I think we cannot do it to the point where organised labour becomes excluded, and I think we need to be very mindful of that. On confrontation, I think our friend from Bangladesh is right in terms that traditional structures are very confrontational, but unfortunately, sometimes that's what you need to do. And, you know, there are times when you've just got to get out on the streets and you just have to fight for what is right and what you believe in and what you need and what you want, and I would never, ever sway from that. But we are seeing more and more in industrial environment, different ways of engaging with employers, different ways that unions are working with employers. I know my comrades from New Zealand that are here with us have certainly lots of examples of different ways to negotiate enterprise bargain agreements and different forms of engagement. We have works councils in Europe that we don't have in Australia, for example. So there are different models emerging for engagement, and I think we need to give them a go and we need to have a look at them. But still, at the end of the day, sometimes you just got to get out there and have a fight for what you think is right.
Okay, thank you, Jed. Florence, would you like to make a comment on that aspect as well, from your experience, those different environments?
Yeah,
I'm sure sometimes the employers feel that as well.
Well, sometimes employers, when we go into negotiation with either unions or other business players, it's always in our interest to know what we want to talk about and what we want to put on the table, what we want to offer, and what we are willing to take. But if we go into a room where the other party on the other side of the table is unwilling to listen, unwilling to put some positive things on the table, then the discussions become stagnant. They become difficult, and at the end of the day, the losers become people at the shop floor level and companies and other suppliers within the chain of activity that lose out. So my attitude about social dialogue, collective bargaining and so on is that the players must understand their role, the players must know what they are in for, and they also must be able to listen and put something on the table that they are also willing to walk away as winners. Not go only in there because you have the one and only agenda that I'm going in there to win and I'm not going to listen to anyone. That's when social dialogue, that's when collective bargaining loses its true purpose.
And I think he made the point that you made, Florence, that training is important. Yes, education.
Training, I think at the end, this is based from my own experience. I do a lot of negotiation with my own union in country. Being a woman, it's a very difficult position to go in when you sit across the table with just men across there from the union, be they from government or be they from interested groups. You find that many will make a lot of noise because they don't really understand the issue, they don't appreciate the sensitivities around the discussions, and so they go in with an attitude that I am going to get what I want. So part of the process is this: let's move away from the traditional way of doing things, being confrontational, being aggressive, or going there without compromise. Let's start learning ways to put things on the table, to teach each other how to talk, how to listen. The more we listen to each other, in my opinion, we'll get things done. And at the end of the day, it's not your personal interest or my personal interest, it's the interest of the larger majority that wait upon the outcome of our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. Just from that round, the question from Tonga about capacity building, certainly I will ask one of our representatives from our Pacific Island country to speak to you on that, just to fill you in on what's available. And I think the questions from Hong Kong were more of a technical nature, which I'll take on notice, and we can deal with those later. In view of the time, I do have two further requests for the floor, and I can just take those two, and then we will need to, three requests for the floor. Sri Lanka, if I can take Sri Lanka first.
Thank you, Moderator. I think the whole objective of the DG's report, building an inclusive future with decent work in order to achieve sustainable development in the year of 2030 in our region. But back to my country, Sri Lanka, though we have ratified all the COW conventions, and we have certain barriers in certain areas. In fact, the migrant workers, they are the main foreign exchanges. They are bringing the main foreign exchange to Sri Lanka, but where there is no freedom of association and there is no collective bargaining. Even our own labor department says that they can't register the trade union because the employers are not within the country. And we have another problem, the plantation industry. Now we are the second major foreign exchanges. And our collective agreement we have since 1992. And for the last 1 year, it was dragged. And ultimately last month, with the government intervention, we were able to sign the agreement with the employers. And thirdly, the multinational companies and the free trade zone, where there is no freedom of association, where there is no collective bargaining. So how are we going to achieve the goal of sustainable development in 2030 if these type of barriers are there in respective countries? And I would like to have the intervention of the panelists, how to overcome this situation from the point of ILO.
Okay, thank you, Sri Lanka. If I can now turn to Japan, please. Delegate from Japan.
Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Sakurada from JTUC Rengo. The social dialogue is the indispensable framework for the socio-economic progress and the social stability. In my country, employers and workers carried out and developed the social dialogue as sound and constructive industrial relation which enable to find out solution for the maximum benefit to all stakeholders, as many as possible. In the private sector, that means the fair distribution of the profit for the productivity increase, and also social partner can share the interest on the macroeconomy issue, labor market, as well as information of the relative companies belonging industrial situation and business results. In doing so, we as social partner developed a mutual understanding and a trust from the different stands. In the public sector, trade union and administrative service as social partner should collaborate to provide soundly the public goods and ensure the quality medical welfare and educational service. Social dialogue is not simply the adjustment mechanism to the employers and workers for defending its own merits. This is a mechanism providing for seeking the better solution by developing and constructing the mutual trust. Such commonly shared solution should be fully inclusive, hopefully no one left behind. Nevertheless, in Japan, we are experiencing the declining of the unionization ratio due to the growing number of the precarious, atypical workers and individual contracts. They are really the workers who cannot enjoy the benefit from the social dialogue. In such situation, how ILO will develop this mechanism in the transition of the industry in the future? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Japan. And finally, China.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make a general comment after listening to the views of the panelists and also the comment from the floor. So the comment is that what is the true meaning of social dialogue? What is the goal of the social dialogue? We thought the meaning, the goal of the social dialogue is try to achieve harmonious labor relation and protect the right of our workers. So there is a different approach to achieve. So the true meaning of the social dialogue is, I think, in my view, is this. So you can't say, really, only adversary situation would be a social dialogue. I don't think that is the case. So I would like to take one moment just to say a few words about the Chinese trade union system. Trade union. I thought in China we have a very well-established trade union system. The trade union, as represented here, and they are participated in lawmaking in our legislation system. So most of the law, particularly those laws related to the well-being of the workers, they are actively involved in the law. That they directly participated in that lawmaking, which served interest of the workers. And they engaged in protection of the right of the workers. They work, for instance, trade unions from the central government, from the national level to the provincial level, participated in various campaigns against, child labor, rare pay in the wage of the workers, and there is quite a number of occasions where they were actually very, very active. And we have a mechanism, a tripartite mechanism that we have across the whole country, over 20,000 tripartite mechanism from national down to the local. And the trade union also participated in the collective agreement negotiation. And I would just like to give you a number, which in China's case, we have 2.7 million collective agreement in China. So in this instance, the system, the trade union system in China plays an indispensable role in protecting our people's well-being and right. I think they play their role well. So I think so that's the true meaning of a social dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, China, for those comments. Well, thank you all for your comments, but the time has come for us to try and wrap up. So what I will ask the panel to do is both give just a very brief conclusion, if they have any, but also, I think from some of those last interventions around the question of the Sustainable Development Goals and social dialogue has come up in a number of comments that's been made. And I think the comment made by Japan about the requirement for that mutual trust in social dialogue. But the second part of the question from Japan relating to the changing nature of work and what that means for representation and social dialogue is something that's being considered as part of the ILO's Future of Work campaign initiative. And so it is very much one of those areas that we are not only interested in but concerned about. And I know that individually many unions and employer organisations are addressing that question as well. So I'll go to our panel again, just if you want to make any comment on those last questions or just some concluding comments. So Director General, I'll start with you again. Thank you.
Okay, I think my concluding comments is there is a need for realizing capacity each actors, even government, union, employers, and other institutions to be strengthened. And by listening to all comments, I think we need to avoid or to find the solutions, the obstacle of the effectiveness of social dialogue. I think this is our responsibility. Then also, we have also, if we don't agree for the mechanism we do now, I think this is also proposed for other countries. So I think we have to decide and consider to establish or improving mechanism. What is the effective mechanism of social dialogue, even at the national level and also at the regional and also sub-regional? I think this is, we propose also to the ILO ILO should assist us, should help us, because the conventions are already there, especially for the countries who ratified this convention. We should have the standard. What is called it standard? What is the requirement? The minimum requirement to establish the union, or the minimum requirement to collect to freedom association for the employers and so on and so on. And the last is put the high commitment, put the higher commitment to encourage other stakeholders. I think this is very important, since the labor is not just industrial relation itself, but also other related institutions, other related actors that we have to open our mind to ask them to sit together in social dialogue. This is, I think, the last comment from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Florence, any concluding comments?
My take for the day, training of actors in social dialogue is key. It's important, and it should be taken up by either individuals or by government, by unions and by employers. Capacity building of the tripartite systems we have, that is something that governments, employers, and trade unions should look into. And also it's a call for the ILO to look at some program and activities around looking at the tripartite systems that we have in place. The other hot agenda for all of us here is the social development goals currently set by the United Nations. There are 17 goals, and how do we as players in this region look at them and how to move them forward? My suggestion is that we take them up as part of our decent work country programs and set plans and activities where employers, workers, and government can engage in effectively. In that way, we will be able to achieve some of the goals set out by the SDGs. And finally, all of this can happen if we continue to collaborate and work together with the ILO and look forward to its further assistance in funding and technical support. That's my take for the day today.
Thank you very much. And Jed, any final comments?
Thanks, Greg. I very much enjoyed the panel, so thanks everyone for listening and for the opportunity. What I think I've taken away from today is that social dialogue, well, we all know, is vital and absolutely critical. It's very broad, but it has to be real, and there has to be true intent and good faith, and there has to be, from all parties, absolute intent to come away with a conclusion. Because as the question was asked, how can we achieve SDGs? How can we achieve good outcome for workers? How can we achieve any of the things that we want to achieve if we don't have social dialogue, collective bargaining, and the freedom to associate? I think that's incredibly important. And one other thing, Greg, is that I've learned is that, sometimes it is confrontational. Sometimes it's not. It can be very broad, and it can be used for things like you pointed out, and our friend from China pointed out. If we use social dialogue to battle the big problems we're facing, climate change, conflicts, as you pointed out before, Ernesto, financial crises. So it's important to all aspects of our lives, working and social and otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Jed. And finally to our expert for any final observations.
Thank you. Thank you. My co-panelists have said a lot about the importance of social dialogue, but what I'm going to say is that there seems to be a broad consensus that the preconditions for social dialogue would be a vibrant and dynamic exercise of freedom of association, the rights to collective bargaining, and the rights to organize and collective bargaining. It seems to me that in the region, there are emergent practices in social dialogue, and these are not very these are not formally, many of them are not formally structured, but the important thing is that they are there, and there is a big opportunity for them to develop. The third point is that we have to be concerned about the growth of social dialogue mechanisms, not only in terms of social dialogue mechanisms as structures, but also social dialogue mechanisms as opportunities for a problem-solving process. So you have to take into account probably the way for countries in the region to improve their social dialogue mechanisms is to look at the substantive aspects, not only on the procedural aspects. And by that I mean there has to be genuine representation. If there is proxy representation, then the representatives must engage who they are representing. Best still is to allow them to capacitate them to represent themselves. But as we see it, I think one way of looking at social dialogue is that it's an experiment in governance. It's a continuing effort by the stakeholders, the social partners and governments. Of course, down the road you have to evaluate the outcomes of social dialogue, so that I think whoever is engaged in the mechanism should be able to look to the future and anticipate what could be the success factors that could be used in evaluating this mechanism moving forward. But I think the most important point that I'd like to stress is that it's a continuing experiment. And so long as we are committed to the process, I think that the potentials are for problem solving and for consensus building and deeper engagement, democratic engagement of the sectors are virtually unlimited. So thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for those final comments. Can I say, from the ILO point of view, I think that we can see that there have been at least 3 points of convergence from the discussion this afternoon. The first one is that it reinforces what an important issue social dialogue is for this region. I think everybody who spoke has indicated the high value they place on it and the critical nature of it. But then the second point of convergence, I think, is that there are still extreme difficulties in terms of making it work effectively and consistently. And I think the third point of convergence was that it is an extremely complex issue, and on which a number of you have called for greater ILO support. We do, of course, endeavour to provide the highest level of support we can to capacity building around social dialogue, but the regional director is sitting in the front row. All of our country office directors are sitting at the side table, and I can assure you they've all taken note of that. And next time we all get together for a discussion on social dialogue, it will be for you all to tell us how well it's now going. So thank you all very much, and could I ask you to join with me in thanking our 4 members of the panel. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand back to the chair of the meeting. Thank you all.